The rancher ordered a bride, but a famous prostitute walked off the wagon. That should have been the end of it. Should have been simple. But nothing about Violet McCall was simple, and Tobias Crow was about to learn that some mistakes change everything. The dust hadn't even settled around the wagon wheels when he knew something was wrong. The woman standing before his ranch house wasn't the plain, God-fearing mail-order bride he'd corresponded with for 3 months. This woman wore a crimson dress that hugged every curve, had painted lips that smiled like she knew secrets he'd never dream of, and carried herself with the kind of confidence that could make a man forget his own name. Tobias stood frozen on his porch, hat in his hands, watching her survey his property like she owned it. She had raven black hair pinned up in a style too elaborate for frontier life, and when her green eyes met his, he felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with disappointment and everything to do with danger. The driver, a weathered man with nervous hands, climbed down from his seat and approached with obvious reluctance. "Mr. Crow?" he asked, though his voice carried the tone of a man delivering bad news. "I got your package here." Package. As if the most beautiful woman Tobias had ever seen was nothing more than a sack of grain or a new saddle. He stepped off the porch, his boots echoing against the wooden boards, and tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The correspondents had described a widow named Sarah Beth Collins from Missouri. Practical, modest, looking for a stable home and honest work. This woman looked like she'd never done an honest day's work in her life, and stability seemed as foreign to her as snow in summer. "There's been some kind of mistake," Tobias said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I ordered a wife, not—" He gestured helplessly at the vision in red standing beside his fence post. Violet McCall laughed, and the sound was like music played in a saloon at midnight, beautiful and dangerous all at once. "No mistake, darling," she said, her voice carrying a southern drawl that made his name sound like honey. "Though I suppose the situation is more complicated than you were led to believe." She reached into a small beaded purse and pulled out a folded letter, the paper yellowed and worn from handling. "Sarah Beth Collins sent me in her place. Said to tell you she found religion and couldn't bear to leave her missionary work." Violet's smile turned sharp. "She also said to tell you that what you really need isn't a wife, but someone who understands the world as it truly is." Tobias took the letter with hands that weren't quite steady. Sarah Beth's familiar handwriting covered the page, but the words made no sense. She wrote about a woman who would serve him better than any traditional wife could, someone who had lived enough life to appreciate what he was offering. She wrote about Violet McCall like she was sending him a gift instead of a scandal. But there was something else in the letter, something that made his blood run cold. Sarah Beth mentioned men looking for Violet, dangerous men who wouldn't stop until they found her. She wrote about debts that couldn't be paid with money and mistakes that followed a person across state lines. "What kind of trouble are you running from?" Tobias asked, folding the letter and studying her face. For just a moment, the confident mask slipped, and he saw something raw and desperate in her eyes. "The kind that gets people killed," she said quietly. "But don't worry, Cowboy. I don't plan on staying long enough for it to catch up with me." That's when he noticed the driver was already back on his wagon, reins in hand, ready to leave without even unloading her trunk. That's when he realized this wasn't a mistake at all, but something far more dangerous. Someone had sent Violet McCall to him knowing exactly what kind of woman she was, and knowing exactly what kind of trouble would follow. The wagon disappeared in a cloud of dust, leaving Tobias alone with a woman who belonged in his world about as much as an orchid belonged in a cattle pen. Violet stood perfectly still, watching him with those calculating green eyes, waiting to see what kind of man he truly was. "You can't stay here," he said, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew how hollow they sounded. The nearest town was a 2-day ride, and the sun was already sinking toward the horizon. "This is a respectable ranch. I have a reputation to consider." Respectable. She tasted the word like it was something bitter. That's a luxury for people who've never had to choose between their reputation and their life. She walked toward him with steps that seemed to measure the distance between them, like a hunter stalking prey. "But I understand your concern, Mr. Crow. A woman like me could ruin a man like you just by breathing the same air." The way she said his name made something tighten in his chest. He'd spent 3 years alone on this ranch. 3 years since his first wife died in childbirth along with their son. 3 years of talking to horses and cattle because human conversation had become a luxury he couldn't afford. Now this dangerous beauty was looking at him like she could see straight through to all his loneliness and need. "It's not just about reputation," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. You said yourself there are men looking for you. Dangerous men. I won't have that kind of trouble brought to my land." Violet tilted her head, and for the first time since stepping off that wagon, she looked genuinely curious about him. "You afraid of a little danger, cowboy? Or are you afraid of me?" Before he could answer, she was close enough that he could smell her perfume, something exotic and expensive that had no business existing in his simple world. She reached out and touched the letter in his hands, her fingers brushing against his knuckles. "Sarah Beth wrote more than what you read aloud," she said softly. "She told me about your wife, about the baby, about how you've been dying a little more each day in this empty house." Her voice carried a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything else about her. She thought maybe someone who understood loss might be exactly what you needed. The words hit him like a physical blow. Sarah Beth had never mentioned knowing about Martha and the baby in any of her letters to him. How could she possibly know details he'd never shared with anyone? "How did she know about my wife?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Violet's smile was sad now, all the sharp edges worn smooth by something that might have been genuine sympathy. "Sarah Beth Collins and I have more history than you might think. We both learned hard lessons about what happens to women who trust the wrong men." That's when he noticed the small scar along her jawline, barely visible unless you knew where to look. That's when he saw the way she held herself, always ready to run or fight. That's when he realized that whatever trouble she was running from had already marked her in ways that wouldn't wash off. "The men looking for me," she continued, her voice dropping to something almost vulnerable. "They're not just dangerous. They're connected to people with long reach and longer memories. People who don't forgive debts or forget faces." A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. "What kind of people?" Violet looked toward the horizon where the sun was painting the sky the color of blood. "The kind who own judges and sheriffs. The kind who make people disappear." She turned back to him, and he saw real fear behind the confidence. "But they don't know about this place. Yet." That single word hung in the air between them like a threat and a promise. Yet. The first stars were appearing when Tobias finally made his decision. "One night," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd already crossed a line he couldn't uncross. "You can stay in the guest room tonight, but come morning, you'll need to find somewhere else to go." Violet's smile was different this time, softer around the edges, like she hadn't expected even that much consideration. "One night it is, then." She moved toward her trunk, still sitting where the driver had left it, and began unfastening the leather straps. "Though I should warn you, Mr. Crow, I'm not exactly the type of house guest you're used to entertaining." He watched her struggle with the heavy trunk and found himself stepping forward to help before he'd made the conscious decision to do so. When his hands covered hers on the brass handle, she looked up at him with something that might have been surprise. "I may not approve of your profession," he said quietly, "but I was raised to treat ladies with respect." "Lady," she laughed, but there was no bitterness in it this time. "It's been a long time since anyone called me that." She let him lift the trunk, and he was struck by how light it seemed for someone who looked like she owned the world. "Most of my belongings had to be left behind. Traveling light makes it easier to disappear." Inside the house, Tobias lit the oil lamps and showed her to the spare room Martha had always hoped would be a nursery. The irony wasn't lost on him, bringing a woman of questionable virtue into the room where he dreamed of raising children. "It's not much," he said, setting her trunk at the foot of the narrow bed, "but it's clean and private." Violet ran her fingers along the patchwork quilt, her touch gentle as if she was afraid it might disappear. "It's perfect," she said, and he heard something in her voice he hadn't expected. Gratitude. Real gratitude. Not the practiced charm she'd worn like armor since stepping off that wagon. "There's fresh water in the basin and clean towels in the chest. I'll have coffee ready at dawn." He turned toward the door, then stopped. "Violet, those men you mentioned, how long before they figure out where you've gone?" She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "They had someone watching Sarah Beth, someone who's been tracking every letter, every contact she's made." She looked at him with eyes that held too much knowledge. "They know about this place, Tobias. They've always known." The blood in his veins turned to ice water. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Sarah Beth didn't send me here to save me. She sent me here to save you." Violet's hands were shaking now, the confident facade completely abandoned. "The men looking for me. They don't just want me back. They want to make an example out of anyone who's helped me, anyone who's shown me kindness." "How long?" His voice was flat, deadly calm. They were 3 days behind me when I left Kansas City. Maybe less now. She wrapped her arms around herself like she was trying to hold the pieces together. I thought I could stay one night, get some rest, and be gone before sunrise. But if they're tracking Sarah Beth's correspondence, they already know I exist. They already know everything. Her voice cracked on the last word. Your name, your ranch, probably even what you had for breakfast 3 weeks ago. These aren't just criminals, Tobias. They're connected to territorial politicians, federal marshals, men with resources you can't imagine. Outside, something moved in the darkness beyond his fence line. It might have been a coyote, or the wind stirring the brush, but Tobias had spent enough nights alone on this land to know the difference between natural sounds and something else entirely. They're already here, aren't they? He whispered. Tobias moved to the window and peered through the gap in the curtains. The moonlight painted his property in silver and shadow, revealing nothing but empty pasture and the dark outline of his barn. But something felt wrong, like the air itself was holding its breath. False alarm, he said, though his hand remained on the rifle he kept by the door. Probably just my imagination running wild. Violet joined him at the window, standing close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. Your imagination didn't survive 3 years alone on a frontier ranch by being careless, she said softly. If something feels wrong, it probably is. She was right, and they both knew it. The silence outside was too complete, too perfect. Even his horses seemed unusually quiet, and his livestock had always been better than any watchdog at sensing danger. Tell me about Sarah Beth, he said, needing to understand how he'd been drawn into this web without his knowledge. How did she know about Martha and the baby? I never mentioned them in my letters. Violet leaned against the window frame, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. Sarah Beth Collins isn't who you think she is, she said after a long moment. Her real name is Sarah Beth Morrison. She was married to a territorial judge in Missouri, a man with connections to some very dangerous people. The name Morrison hit him like a physical blow. Judge Morrison had been mentioned in newspapers across 3 territories, always in connection with controversial rulings that favored wealthy landowners and railroad barons over common settlers. She was his wife until she discovered what he was really involved in, Violet continued. Human trafficking, land fraud, political corruption that went all the way to Washington. When she tried to leave him, he had her declared mentally incompetent and locked away. How did she escape? She didn't. I broke her out. Violet's voice carried a pride that surprised him. Judge Morrison owned the brothel where I worked. He used it to compromise politicians and businessmen, gathering secrets he could use for leverage. Sarah Beth and I became friends during his visits, and when I learned what he'd done to her, I couldn't stand by and watch. Pieces of the puzzle were finally beginning to fit together, but the picture they formed was more terrifying than anything Tobias had imagined. So the men hunting you work for Judge Morrison, and now they're hunting Sarah Beth too, along with anyone who's helped either of us. She turned to face him fully, and he saw genuine remorse in her eyes. I didn't know she'd been corresponding with you. I didn't know she'd sent me to someone innocent. But you came anyway. I was desperate. When someone offers you a lifeline, you don't ask too many questions about where it leads. She reached out and touched his arm, her fingers warm against his skin. But now I've dragged you into something that could get you killed, and I can't live with that. Outside, one of his horses whinnied softly, the sound carrying a note of anxiety that made both of them freeze. Tobias had owned those animals for years and knew every sound they made. That wasn't the call of a horse sensing a predator or reacting to weather. That was the sound of a horse recognizing human strangers. How many men are we talking about? Tobias asked, already moving toward his gun cabinet. Morrison keeps a private security force of at least 6 men. Ex-military, ex-law enforcement, the kind who ask questions after they pull the trigger. Violet's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. They're professional killers, Tobias. This isn't some frontier justice you can settle with a fair fight. He pulled out his shotgun and began loading shells with practiced efficiency. Maybe not, but this is my land, and I know every inch of it better than they do. You don't understand, she said urgently. They don't just kill people, they destroy them. Your reputation, your livelihood, everyone you've ever cared about. Morrison has judges and sheriffs in his pocket across 5 territories. That's when they heard the sound that confirmed their worst fears. The careful, deliberate footsteps of someone trying very hard not to be heard. Tobias motioned for Violet to stay low as he crept toward the front door. The footsteps had stopped, which somehow felt more menacing than if they'd continued. Whoever was out there knew how to hunt human prey. 3 years ago, Violet whispered, her voice barely audible. You filed a claim against the Territorial Railroad Commission. Do you remember? He froze, his hand on the door handle. Of course he remembered. The railroad had tried to run tracks through his property without compensation, claiming eminent domain. He'd fought them in court and won. But the victory had cost him most of his savings and made him enemies in high places. Judge Morrison was the one who ruled against you initially, she continued, before the appeal went to federal court. Your case cost him a substantial bribe from the railroad barons. Everything clicked into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't about Violet at all. Not entirely. This was about settling an old score, eliminating a man who'd had the audacity to stand up to corrupt territorial politics. Sarah Beth sent you here because she knew they were already planning to come for me, he said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. She thought if I was here, if it looked like you were harboring a known fugitive, they could justify whatever they planned to do to you. Violet's voice carried a weight of guilt that made his chest tight. She was trying to give you a fighting chance by making sure you knew danger was coming. A window shattered in the back of the house, followed immediately by the heavy thud of boots on his kitchen floor. These weren't men who planned to take prisoners or ask questions. They'd come to finish what the legal system had failed to accomplish. Tobias grabbed Violet's hand and pulled her toward the back door, but more sounds from that direction told them their escape route was already cut off. They were surrounded, trapped in the house he'd built with his own hands, the home where he'd planned to raise a family. The root cellar, he whispered, leading her toward a concealed trapdoor near the fireplace. It connects to an old mine shaft. We can get out through the barn. Tobias Crow, a voice called from outside, calm and professional. This is Deputy Marshal Crawford. We have a federal warrant for the arrest of Violet McCall and any person harboring a known fugitive. Federal Marshal. That meant Morrison's reach extended even further than Violet had realized. A territorial judge with federal law enforcement connections was more dangerous than any outlaw gang. We know you're both inside, the voice continued. Surrender now, and we'll make this easy on everyone involved. Violet squeezed his hand, and he felt her trembling. They're not here to arrest anyone, she whispered. Crawford works for Morrison directly. I've seen him before. Heavy footsteps moved through his kitchen, methodical and searching. More glass broke, this time from his bedroom window. They were conducting a room-by-room search, which meant they had maybe minutes before being discovered. Tobias lifted the trapdoor as quietly as he could, revealing the narrow wooden ladder that led down into darkness. The root cellar had been dug by the previous owner, a paranoid man who'd feared Indian attacks that never came. Now it might be the only thing standing between them and death. Ladies first, he whispered, but Violet shook her head. If something happens to you, I'm dead anyway. You go first. Her green eyes were fierce in the lamplight. Besides, Cowboy, I've been running from killers longer than you have. Before he could argue, she leaned forward and kissed him, soft and quick and desperate. Her lips tasted like fear and determination, and something that might have been hope. That's in case we don't make it, she whispered against his mouth. Then the front door exploded inward, and their time ran out. Tobias dropped through the trapdoor first, landing hard in the narrow space below. The root cellar smelled of earth and old potatoes, but the air was breathable, and the tunnel stretched toward the barn just as he remembered. Above him, Violet followed, pulling the trapdoor closed behind her just as boots thundered across his living room floor. Where's that tunnel? She whispered, her voice tight with controlled panic. He grabbed her hand and led her through the darkness, feeling along the rough-hewn walls with his free hand. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for one person, and they had to move single file toward what he hoped was still a viable exit. Behind them, muffled voices echoed through the house. Check every room. Tear the place apart if you have to. Crawford wants them alive, another voice replied. Morrison's orders. Violet stumbled behind him, catching herself against the tunnel wall. Why alive? She whispered. Morrison's never cared about keeping witnesses breathing before. That was a question Tobias didn't want to consider too carefully. Men like Judge Morrison didn't keep people alive out of mercy. They kept them alive because they needed something. And whatever Morrison needed from them was likely worse than a quick death. The tunnel began to slope upward, which meant they were approaching the barn foundation. Tobias could smell hay and horse leather, familiar scents that should have been comforting, but now felt like a trap waiting to spring. If Crawford's men were as professional as Violet claimed, they'd have someone watching the obvious escape routes. "There's something else," Violet said quietly as they climbed. "Something I didn't tell you about Sarah Beth's letter." Even now, even with armed killers searching his house, she was still holding back information. "What?" "She wrote about a safe. Said you inherited one from your wife's family, along with some documents that might be valuable to the wrong people." Violet's breathing was labored from the climb and the fear. "Morrison doesn't just want to eliminate you because of the railroad case. He wants whatever Martha's family left behind." Tobias stopped climbing so suddenly that Violet bumped into his back. Martha's family safe. He'd forgotten about it completely. A heavy iron box that had come with other inherited items he'd stored in the barn loft. Martha's father had been a surveyor for the territorial government before his death, a man who'd mapped railroad routes and mineral deposits across 3 states. "Survey maps," he breathed. Her father documented ore deposits and water rights that the government never officially recorded. Maps that could be worth millions to the right buyers, or used to destroy railroad contracts that were based on false geographical claims. Violet's voice carried a new understanding. "This isn't about you filing one legal challenge, Tobias. This is about you accidentally inheriting evidence that could bring down Morrison's entire operation." Above them, the barn door creaked open. Footsteps moved across the wooden floor with careful precision, and hay rustled as someone searched the stalls. They were trapped between the men in the house and whoever was now searching their only exit. "We need those maps," Violet whispered urgently. "They're the only thing keeping us alive. As long as Morrison doesn't know where they are, he can't afford to kill us." "The loft," Tobias replied. 20 feet above whoever's in my barn right now." Through the thin wooden floorboards above their heads, they could hear a man moving methodically from stall to stall. The search was thorough, professional, and getting closer to the tunnel exit with each passing second. That's when Tobias realized the fatal flaw in their plan. The tunnel exit was directly beneath the barn loft where Martha's safe was hidden. To reach their only leverage against Morrison, they'd have to surface in the exact spot where Crawford's man was conducting his search. The sound of boots stopped directly above them. Through gaps in the floorboards, Tobias could see the outline of a man with a rifle, methodically checking each corner of the barn. They had maybe 30 seconds before he discovered the tunnel entrance. Violet pressed something cold and metallic into his hand. A small derringer, the kind of weapon a woman in her profession might hide in her corset for protection. 2 shots, she whispered against his ear. "Make them count. I can't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm offering." Her green eyes were fierce in the dim light filtering down from above. "Besides, Cowboy, I've got more experience with desperate situations than you do." The man above them moved toward the ladder leading to the loft where Martha's safe waited. If he climbed up there, he'd have the high ground and a clear shot at anyone emerging from the tunnel. But if they acted now, while he was focused on the search, they might have surprise on their side. Tobias made his decision. He pushed open the tunnel exit as quietly as possible and rolled out behind a pile of hay bales, the derringer ready in his hand. The searcher was 20 feet away, his back turned as he examined the loft ladder. "Drop the rifle," Tobias said softly. The man spun around with professional speed, but Violet was already emerging from the tunnel behind him, and she moved like someone who'd spent years surviving by being faster and smarter than men with bigger guns. She picked up a pitchfork from the wall and pressed the sharp tines against the back of his neck before he could bring his weapon to bear. "Deputy Marshal Crawford, I presume," she said sweetly. "Though we both know that badge is as real as your concern for federal law." Crawford was a tall man with the kind of scars that came from years of violent work. He didn't look afraid, which made him more dangerous than someone who might panic. "Miss McCall, Judge Morrison will be pleased to see you again." "I'm sure he will be, right up until the moment those survey maps get delivered to the real federal authorities." Violet's voice carried a confidence that Tobias hoped wasn't entirely bluff. "Tell me, Crawford, does Morrison know that Tobias figured out what Martha's father documented in those maps?" Something shifted in Crawford's expression. "What maps?" The question came too quickly with too much genuine curiosity. Crawford didn't know about the safe. Morrison had sent him to eliminate Tobias and capture Violet, but he hadn't told his hired killers about the real treasure hidden in the barn loft. "The survey maps that prove Morrison's been falsifying geological reports for railroad companies for the past 5 years, Tobias said, playing along with Violet's bluff. "The ones that show he's been selling mineral rights to land that belongs to the federal government." Crawford's face went pale. A crime like that wouldn't just bring down Morrison. It would implicate every territorial official who'd been part of the conspiracy. Men like Crawford, who'd been taking Morrison's money, would face federal prison or worse. "Those maps don't exist," Crawford said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Then why are you here?" Violet pressed the pitchfork harder against his neck. Why did Morrison send 6 armed men to kill 1 rancher and capture 1 prostitute? What's so valuable about this particular piece of land that it's worth murder? That's when they heard horses approaching the ranch at full gallop, multiple riders, moving fast and with purpose. Through the barn window, Tobias could see torches in the distance, at least 4 men heading directly toward his property. "Backup?" he asked Crawford. The man's smile was cold and predatory. "Insurance. Morrison doesn't like leaving loose ends, and he especially doesn't like leaving loose ends that might know about non-existent survey maps." Violet met Tobias's eyes across the barn, and he saw the same terrible understanding reflected there. Morrison hadn't just sent men to kill them. He'd sent men to kill everyone involved, including his own hired guns. Crawford and his associates knew too much about Morrison's operations to be allowed to survive. "Those riders aren't here to help you," Tobias told Crawford. "They're here to clean up Morrison's mess. All of it." For the first time since they'd captured him, Crawford looked genuinely afraid. Crawford's fear became their salvation. Faced with the choice between certain death from Morrison's cleanup crew or uncertain survival with his former targets, he chose the devil he could negotiate with. "There's a back trail through the canyon," he said quickly, his earlier confidence completely abandoned. "My horse is tied behind the house. If we move now, we can be gone before Morrison's killers arrive." "After we get those maps," Violet said firmly, keeping the pitchfork pressed against his neck. Tobias climbed to the loft with Crawford's rifle, while Violet watched their prisoner. The safe was exactly where he remembered, hidden beneath old horse blankets and forgotten farm equipment. His hands shook as he worked the combination Martha had made him memorize years ago, afraid the mechanism might have rusted shut. The lock clicked open, and inside were the rolled survey documents that would change everything. Her father's careful handwriting detailed mineral deposits, water rights, and land boundaries that contradicted every official territorial map from the past decade. Railroad companies had paid Morrison enormous bribes for rights to land that was either worthless or belonged to the federal government. "Got them," he called down, stuffing the maps inside his shirt. The sound of approaching horses was getting closer. Through the barn window, Tobias could see 4 riders with torches, their faces hidden beneath hat brims pulled low. These weren't lawmen or even hired guns trying to look official. These were executioners. Crawford had been telling the truth about one thing. Morrison was eliminating everyone connected to this operation. "Move," Violet ordered, and the 3 of them ran for Crawford's horse. The animal was a sturdy bay mare, built for long distances and rough terrain. Crawford mounted first, then helped Violet up behind him, while Tobias swung onto his own horse from the corral. They rode hard toward the canyon trail, leaving behind the only home Tobias had ever known. Behind them, orange light bloomed against the darkness as torches touched dry wood. Morrison's men were burning his ranch, destroying any evidence that might connect their boss to the night's activities. The house where Martha had died, the barn where he'd planned to store hay for cattle he'd never own, all of it disappearing in flames. But Crawford's local knowledge proved invaluable. The canyon trail was narrow and treacherous, impossible to follow in darkness without someone who knew every turn and switchback. By dawn, they were 30 miles away and climbing toward the territorial capital. 3 days later, they sat in the office of Federal Marshal William Hayes, watching him examine the survey documents with growing amazement and fury. Hayes was one of the few federal officials Morrison hadn't been able to buy or intimidate, and the evidence spread across his desk represented the largest territorial corruption case in Western history. "Judge Morrison will face federal charges for conspiracy, fraud, and murder," Hayes told them. "Crawford's testimony combined with these documents will put him away for life." Crawford, granted immunity in exchange for his cooperation, nodded grimly. "Morrison's network reaches into 7 territories,